In the years before the Great Sickness arrived, Europe moved through its days with a gentle, unthinking rhythm. Villages woke to the sound of wooden wheels on dirt paths, the murmur of animals being led toward pasture, and the faint chiming of church bells drifting through cool morning air. Fields stretched across rolling hills like pieces of an old tapestry, tended by hands that believed tomorrow would look much like today. Nothing in the quiet routine suggested that the continent stood at the edge of a transformation so vast that generations would later speak of the time before and the time after, as if they were two different worlds. Merchants in crowded markets haggled over spices, fabrics, and grain, their voices rising in familiar patterns. Monks copied manuscripts in dim rooms where candles flickered against stone walls. Sailors repaired nets beside still harbours, waiting for the winds to turn. Everywhere, life felt predictable, almost drowsy, like a song that had been sung for centuries. And yet, in certain corners of this world, small signals hinted that something was shifting. Weather changed in ways that farmers could not explain. Harvests thinned, even when the soil seemed healthy. Caravans from distant lands arrived later than usual, carrying rumours that curled through taverns like smoke. Most people ignored these murmurs. They trusted the comfort of routine, believing the land itself would keep them safe. But beneath this trust lay an unspoken fragility. Kingdoms argued over borders, nobles quarrelled for advantage, and hunger lingered on the edges of poor households. These tensions were quiet, almost invisible, but they weakened the structure of society the way tiny cracks weaken stone long before anyone notices. On certain evenings, travellers on lonely roads felt an unusual chill, as if the air carried a question it could not form. In some ports, fishermen reported catching fewer fish. In a few towns, traders mentioned strange illnesses appearing briefly along eastern routes, only to vanish before anyone paid attention. Each sign was small enough to pass without alarm, yet together they created an uneasy silence beneath Europe's surface. A silence that waited. If someone had paused to observe the continent with a wider gaze, they might have sensed that Europe was not as steady as it seemed. The calm that people trusted was thinner than they realized, stretched tight over hidden weaknesses. Life continued, warm and familiar, but history was quietly holding its breath, preparing to turn a page no one expected. As this fragile peace settled across fields, harbours, and roads, a subtle shift far beyond Europe began its slow approach, moving along paths few eyes ever saw. And though no one here knew it yet, the force that would reshape their world had already begun its long journey west. Across distant horizons, winds carried whispers of change, brushing over deserts, mountains, and caravan trails. What travelled with them was small, unseen, and unstoppable, beginning a journey that would slip into Europe quietly, altering every life it touched forever soon. Far beyond the edges of the European imagination, in a stretch of mountains where winter winds carved ridges into the earth, a quiet imbalance began to unfold. The land seemed unchanged to any traveller passing through endless grasslands, scattered forests, and valleys shaped by ancient storms. Yet beneath this stillness, small creatures stirred in unusual ways. Rodent populations rose and fell with strange rhythm, as if something in the climate had shifted the delicate balance that kept them in check. Fleas, tiny and impatient, searched for new hosts when familiar ones disappeared. Nothing about these movements felt dramatic, but each carried the weight of a beginning no one recognized. In some years, the summers burned hotter than before. In others, sudden cold snaps swept across the plateaus, forcing animals to migrate unpredictably. These changes pressed rodents into tighter spaces, creating bursts of competition and stress. In such crowded burrows, sickness spread easily, though almost invisibly. What mattered was not the illness itself, but the quiet chain of reactions it sparked: fleas feeding on infected blood, then abandoning dying hosts to cling to whatever warmth they could find. Each decision made by instinct, each movement guided only by survival, nudged a microscopic force a little closer to the wider world. This region, often dismissed by distant kingdoms as empty wilderness, was in truth woven into the heart of Asia's great networks. Caravans passed through mountain passes with the patience of drifting clouds. Horses, camels, and worn carts carried silks, spices, stories, and secrets between empires. The Mongol conquests had tied vast territories together, creating safer roads and faster routes. Traders could travel farther with fewer dangers, and with them travelled everything they carried intentionally, and everything they carried unknowingly. Along these paths, fleas found new opportunities, hiding in furs, sacks of grain, folds of fabric, and the warm corners of wagons. For generations, pockets of plague had slept in these wild places. Reservoirs of infection lived quietly in rodent colonies that rose and fell with the seasons. The disease did not need to conquer, it needed only to endure. But in the 1,330 seconds, something shifted. Perhaps a series of harsh winters weakened animal populations. Perhaps drought pushed creatures into new territories, blending groups that had long been separate. Or perhaps trade increased so rapidly that the old boundaries no longer held. Whatever the cause, the balance broke. A sickness that once remained contained within secluded ecosystems began to slip into the moving veins of human commerce. Travelers first noticed unusual patterns long before they understood their meaning. Some caravans reported dead animals along the roadside. Others spoke of unfamiliar fevers appearing in distant settlements, flaring briefly and dying out before anyone sought explanations. A few merchants mentioned uncanny silences in places usually filled with noise. These stories drifted along trade routes slowly, carried from mouth to mouth, dismissed as local misfortunes. Yet each rumour added another thread to a tapestry of warning that stretched across the continent, though no one yet knew what picture it formed. Meanwhile, the Great Steppe remained a landscape of motion. Horses thundered across open fields. Traders bartered in temporary camps that vanished with the dawn. Messengers rode between outposts with news of regional conflicts and shifting alliances. Through every exchange, every greeting, every shared meal beside a campfire, the plague found new vessels. Men who believed they were transporting ordinary goods were in fact carrying a future that could not be bargained with. Fleas clung to fabrics, rodents hid in cargo. Invisible passengers travelled farther in a month than they once could in a lifetime. If anyone could have stood above the continent and traced the paths of movement, they might have seen the pattern forming the slow gathering of forces, the convergence of tiny accidents becoming something vast. But from the ground, everything appeared harmless. Traders focused on profit, soldiers on duty, wanderers on survival. No one sensed the pressure building behind the scenes of ordinary life. The world kept moving, unaware that it carried within it the beginning of a storm that would challenge every kingdom it touched. With the spark lit in the east, the unseen fire began its long descent toward the west, following roads, rivers, ambitions, and mistakes. Soon, the first embers would reach shores unprepared for the darkness travelling toward them. Along the ancient roads that stitched Asia to the Mediterranean, the plague began to find its momentum. Caravans moved steadily across the dust-coloured earth, each step of their animals pressing deeper into trails worn by centuries of travellers. The air along these routes carried the scent of wool, spices, and weary bodies. But hidden among these familiar smells was something else, something no one could detect. Fleas nestled in the fur of pack animals, in sacks of grain, in the folds of heavy coats. Each caravan that crossed a mountain pass unknowingly pulled the disease a little farther west. Movement defined this world. Traders followed the same pathways season after season, linking distant kingdoms through exchanges of silk, metal, and stories whispered around fires. Soldiers marched in long columns beside wagons filled with supplies. Pilgrims travelled with slow reverence, trusting the road to guide them safely toward sacred destinations. Every group carried with them the rhythm of journeying, the belief that travel simply connected one place to another. Yet now the roads themselves held a dangerous secret. Each mile covered by human feet widened the reach of the sickness that had stirred quietly in the east. As caravans descended from the highlands and entered bustling trade stations, the pace of spread increased. Way stations were crowded places, filled with travellers seeking water, food, or rest after long days on the move. Animals slept huddled together. Merchants leaned over tables piled with goods, inspecting objects touched by countless hands. The disease seeped into these spaces effortlessly, settling into corners and crates, waiting for the next group to continue its journey. What appeared to be ordinary traffic, merely the flow of life along the Silk Road, had become the perfect network for an invisible passenger. Farther west, merchant fleets rocked in gentle harbours, their crews preparing for departure. These ships waited for favourable winds, unaware that tiny carriers crawled across their decks. Rats hid in the shadows between crates, and fleas clung to them with patient determination. When a ship finally pushed away from shore, it carried more than spices or textiles. It carried a microscopic threat, ready to cross entire seas. The calm surface of the water masked the quiet spread beneath the hull, as if the world were trying to hold its breath against what moved across it. Military campaigns also played their part. Armies marched with discipline, but discipline could not protect them from the hidden presence in their camps. Camps were crowded and filled with supplies taken from countless villages. Shared tents, shared bedding, and shared meals created countless opportunities for the plague to slip from one person to another. Soldiers who believed they were advancing the interests of their leaders were unknowingly carrying the seeds of catastrophe toward new territories. All of these movements converged in a handful of vital ports, and one of the most important was the city of Kaffa. Positioned on the shores of the Black Sea, it was a center of fierce commercial rivalry. Merchants from Genoa battled for trade advantages, while the Mongol armies watched from the surrounding plains. It was here, in this pressured landscape of wealth and conflict, that the plague found the conditions it needed to ignite into something far more devastating. During the siege of Kaffa, tensions between the besieged Genoese and the Mongols turned desperate. Disease had already begun to tear through the Mongol forces. Soldiers fell ill in staggering numbers, their camps filled with fever, weakness, and death. As bodies piled up, a grim strategy emerged. Accounts claim that the Mongols ordered the corpses of their fallen to be hurled over the city walls with massive catapults. The dead became weapons. Each body that landed inside the city carried the possibility of spreading the plague among defenders who had believed themselves protected by high stone walls. Whether this act was truly one of deliberate biological assault or simply a desperate attempt to break the siege hardly mattered to those inside. Panic spread quickly. The disease had found a pathway shaped by fear itself. Traders and sailors inside Kaffa realized the city was doomed, and many sought to escape. They rushed to their waiting ships, carrying supplies, memories of the siege, and unknowingly, the plague. The harbour, filled with frantic movement as anchors were raised and sails unfurled. From this dark edge of the Black Sea, vessels began their voyage west. From Kaffa's harbour, the plague gained access to the open sea, moving not with the slow pace of caravans, but with the speed of wind and tide. The ships carried not just cargo, but a future Europe was unprepared to face. No one aboard understood that the hurried escape marked the moment when a whisper from the east became a storm, poised to sweep across kingdoms, cities, and villages alike. The first ships drifted toward the Sicilian coast, under a sky washed pale by autumn light, their sails hanging like tired wings after a long journey across the Black Sea. Dockworkers watching from the shore noticed nothing unusual at first. The vessels seemed no different from the many that arrived each season, carrying grain, fabrics, and stories from distant ports. But as the anchors dropped and the crews prepared to disembark, an unease settled over the harbour. Sailors staggered across the decks with strange heaviness, as though their bones had turned to stone during the voyage. Their faces were grey, their breaths shallow, and yet they said nothing that hinted at the nightmare travelling beside them. Rats scurried down the mooring ropes before the first men even stepped onto the docks. They moved quickly, disappearing into crates, alleys, and storage houses, their small bodies carrying something neither they nor the people around them understood. In the beginning, the sickness did not announce itself with screams or chaos. It arrived the way night falls quietly, steadily, unnoticed, until it is already everywhere. The first deaths were dismissed as misfortune. A sailor who collapsed shortly after landing, a boy who helped unload cargo and fell ill within a day, a merchant who complained of fever and swelling before retreating to a rented room he never left again. These early signs passed like scattered shadows, strange but not yet terrifying. Ports were accustomed to illness. Ships carried all manner of fevers. People accepted that the sea gave prosperity and peril in equal measure. But soon, something changed. Whole groups of sailors began collapsing within hours of one another. Their skin darkened in blotches. Swellings rose beneath their arms and around their necks. Rumours spread through the markets that the sickness tore through bodies with unnatural speed. The calm rhythm of the harbour cracked. Dockworkers refused to approach certain ships. Fishermen kept their distance. Even the gulls seemed quieter, circling overhead without their usual shrill cries. When word reached Genoa and other coastal cities, fear moved faster than the ships themselves. Officials attempted to restrict entry, but their measures came too late. Vessels that had managed to leave Kaffa before the worst of the siege now scattered across the Mediterranean like drifting embers. Each one carried infected sailors, stowaway rodents, and supplies touched by the hands of the dying. By the time leaders understood the magnitude of the threat, the disease was already inside crowded streets, settling into corners no decree could seal. In Sicily, households locked their doors as neighbors fell ill. Priests moved from home to home offering prayers, but many themselves began to collapse mid-ritual. Markets thinned as fear rooted itself in the hearts of vendors. Streets that once hummed with laughter and shouts now filled with whispers. People spoke of a force that leapt from body to body, a presence that seemed almost aware of those who tried to escape it. In Genoa, panic sharpened quickly. The city was a hub of trade, its lifeblood dependent on the constant arrival and departure of ships. But now, the same routes that had enriched the region became corridors of danger. Officials ordered quarantines. Dock gates closed. Guards patrolled the harbours. Yet the plague had not come as something that could be stopped at a border. It moved with the very rhythm of human life, through touch, proximity, and motion. Families fled the city, hoping the countryside would offer safety, but unknowingly carried the illness with them into quiet valleys and distant farms. As the disease slipped inland, the transformation became impossible to ignore. Villages reported entire households dying within days. Travellers warned of abandoned carts on the roads, their owners nowhere in sight. Ferrymen along rivers hesitated to take passengers, unsure who might be carrying the invisible threat. A sense of dread settled across the land like a cold fog, thickening with each passing hour. People began to realize this was not an ordinary illness. It struck too fast, moved too mysteriously, and left too much devastation in its wake. Some described it as a darkness that traveled inside breath. Others said it behaved like a creature, choosing its victims with terrible intent. Whether these beliefs were superstition or attempts to make sense of the unfathomable hardly mattered. The feeling was the same everywhere. Europe had been touched by something alive, something relentless, something that did not pause to rest or reconsider. The first arrivals had opened a door that could no longer be closed. And from those quiet harbours in 1347, the plague began its ruthless march northward. The roads ahead would carry it farther still, following traders, wanderers, and frightened families who never understood they were guiding a continent into darkness. The plague swept across southern Europe with a momentum that seemed to ignore the limits of distance or belief. Towns that hoped prayer or isolation might shield them soon learned that the sickness travelled with anything that moved. Merchants continued their journeys, unwilling to abandon their livelihoods. Families fled in panic, carrying with them the very danger they sought to escape. Animals wandered freely between farms, markets, and alleys. Every step taken by human or creature widened the reach of something no one could fully understand. Cities tried to defend themselves by sealing their gates and posting guards who watched every newcomer. But no barrier could stop an enemy too small to see. The illness slipped past walls on clothing fibers, in the breath of travellers, or on the backs of rats that scurried through hidden cracks. Physicians attempted to explain its nature using old theories about poisoned air, corrupted vapours, or troubled skies. Some burned herbs, others drained blood, or mixed antidotes from recipes passed down through generations. None of their efforts slowed the spread. Many physicians became among the earliest victims, collapsing beside the patients they tried to heal. Priests were torn between duty and terror. Some walked through the streets, offering prayers to comfort those who could no longer be saved. Others retreated into monasteries, hoping seclusion might spare them. A few refused to approach the sick at all, overwhelmed by the scale of the suffering. Their reactions reflected a broader uncertainty. The people who were expected to provide answers had none. The clergy held authority over the spiritual world, but the plague seemed untouched by faith. Nobles attempted to protect their estates by withdrawing behind guarded gates with servants and supplies. Yet even fortified manors proved fragile. A single infected visitor returning from an errand could bring the sickness into halls that seemed unreachable. Rumours spread about noble families struck down within days, their wealth offering no shield against what stalked the land. In rural villages, the devastation arrived silently. Small communities depended on close contact to survive. When the plague entered such places, it moved with shocking speed, leaving cottages abandoned and fields untended. Travelers sometimes found entire settlements emptied, with doors standing open and tools dropped mid-task. The countryside developed an eerie stillness, as though time itself had paused in mourning. Isolation became the only strategy people trusted, but isolation bred suspicion. Strangers were avoided. Neighbors eyed one another with fear. Families refused to assist relatives who showed even mild signs of illness. Fear spread faster than the plague, unraveling relationships that once held communities together. People felt the world slipping beyond human will, as though an unseen hand had taken control. Across the region, helplessness thickened like mist. Every attempt to resist the sickness revealed how little medieval society understood about disease. The tools available, faith, tradition, speculation, held no power against a force that moved unseen through homes and markets. The patterns of life dissolved, markets emptied, workshops fell silent. Festivals and gatherings disappeared without ceremony. Daily routines shrank to waiting, watching, and hoping the sickness would pass someone by. By the time leaders grasped the scale of the disaster, the plague had already threaded itself through cities, villages, coastlines, and inland roads. No plan emerged to slow it. No boundary proved firm enough to contain it. The illness advanced with a determination that left people clinging to whatever fragments of normalcy they had left. Fear lingered everywhere, altering the rhythm of life, even in towns not yet touched. As the spread intensified, the fragile fabric of society began to unravel from within. As the plague tightened its hold on southern Europe, the crisis unfolded not only in bodies, but in the minds of those who witnessed its approach. People watched their families fall into fever and darkness with a helplessness they could scarcely describe. In this void of understanding, the search for meaning became urgent. Some believed the sickness was divine punishment, a sweeping reminder of human guilt. They knelt in streets and churches, whispering prayers meant to sway a distant and silent heaven. Others interpreted the terror as a sign that the world itself was entering a final reckoning, that creation had grown weary of human mistakes. Others believed the danger rose from the earth itself. They spoke of corrupted air drifting through valleys, of foul winds rolling in from distant shores. Physicians, lacking better explanations, leaned toward these theories, insisting that smoke, herbs, or isolation might defend households. Their efforts brought little comfort. The sickness moved too quickly, too strangely. Many began to fear that the world had slipped beyond anything human hands could influence. Suspicion twisted communities. Outsiders, minorities, and travelers became convenient bearers of blame. Rumors of poisoned wells and malicious plots spread through villages already weakened by grief. Some believed foreign merchants carried destruction in their goods. Others pointed to wandering pilgrims, insisting that the illness followed in their footsteps. Fear replaced trust, cutting through old friendships and dissolving the fragile ties that held neighbors together. Yet even within this atmosphere of dread, scattered lights of courage remained. Chroniclers wrote of parents who refused to abandon their children, of friends who stayed at the bedside of the dying despite knowing the risk, of priests who continued their rounds until they themselves collapsed. These gestures did not change the outcome, but they revealed the stubborn tenderness that survived beneath the rising panic. For those who fell ill, the world often shrank to a haze of sensation. Some felt sudden chills, as though a shadow had passed through their bones. Others endured burning fevers that warped memory and time. People drifting between consciousness and delirium tried to understand what was happening to them, clinging to fragments of faith or familiar sounds in a home that was becoming unrecognizable. Families waited beside them, fearing each breath might be the last. Letters and diaries from the era reveal how the plague reshaped inner landscapes. Writers confessed to questioning beliefs they once held steady. Some found comfort in imagining life as a brief spiritual trial. Others felt abandoned by the heavens, shaken by the silence of prayers unanswered. A few retreated into themselves, choosing solitude over the constant fear of loss. During a time when the world seemed to unravel, the mind became its own battlefield. As explanations faltered, stories emerged to fill the void. Some claimed the plague had arrived with a blazing comet. Others believed spirits walked the roads at night, seeking new victims. There were tales of omens in animal behavior, of shadows moving at the edge of villages. These stories grew not from ignorance alone, but from the deep human need to shape chaos into something bearable. Slowly, as days blurred into weeks, people changed. Some locked themselves away, determined to face the crisis alone. Others sought companionship as a final defense against dread. Rituals were either clung to with fierce devotion or abandoned without ceremony. What remained constant was uncertainty, a feeling that life had slipped beyond understanding. In this landscape of fear, belief, memory, and imagination, the plague reshaped more than bodies. It altered thought itself, bending minds toward extremes of hope and despair. And as these inner fractures spread through households and communities, they prepared the ground for a wider collapse, one that soon reached into the structure of European society. In the great cities of Europe, the plague did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It slipped instead through narrow gates and torch-lit corridors, settling into the rhythm of urban life like a shadow learning to breathe. At first, nothing seemed different. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn. Market stalls opened with familiar clatter. Church towers rose above crowded rooftops, catching the morning light on their stone faces. Yet beneath this ordinary pulse, an invisible pressure began to build, quiet but persistent, like a rope being tugged strand by strand. The first signs were subtle. A shop left unopened for a day, then two. A neighbor who failed to answer a knock. A sudden emptiness in the soundscape of a street. One fewer voice, one fewer footstep. In cities where people lived shoulder to shoulder, these absences should have been impossible to miss. Yet the pace of life was so constant, so dense, that the early vanishings dissolved into the blur of daily noise. Only when the spaces widened, when more shutters stayed closed, when more doorways remained unlit, did people begin to sense something was wrong. The alleys were the first places to change. They grew quieter as days passed, their usual buzz of children, vendors, and animals replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. Laundry hung untouched on lines strung between windows, buckets sat abandoned beside wells. Even the stray dogs seemed reluctant to wander, as if instinct warned them of a danger beyond scent or sound. Overhead, church bells began to toll more frequently, echoing against stone walls with a heaviness that seemed to press on the streets themselves. As sickness spread, the city's essential systems began to break apart. Bread vanished from stalls because millers and bakers had fallen ill. Wells went unguarded because the men who tended them had not returned from their duties. Night watch patrols thinned until the city seemed unprotected, its usual order slipping into soft disarray. Without those who sustained its structure, the city began to sag inward, like a great building losing support beam after support beam. Markets, once the thrum of urban life, turned into ghostly spaces. Stalls remained half-filled, abandoned mid-trade. Scales lay untouched, fruit spoiled beneath flies. Merchants who once shouted prices across the square retreated into their homes, leaving only a handful of desperate buyers searching for food that no longer arrived. The great arteries of commerce streets that once pulsed with wagons, workers, and animals felt as though they were struggling for air. Churches, too, bore the weight of the crisis. Their doors remained open, but their pews filled not with worshippers seeking comfort, but with the sick lying in makeshift beds, waiting for help that rarely came. Priests moved quietly along aisles thick with incense and fear. Candles flickered beside statues whose stone expressions remained unchanged, indifferent to the waves of grief flowing beneath them. The spiritual heart of the city began to falter, not because belief vanished, but because there were too few hands left to sustain ritual and care. Inside homes, families sealed themselves in, hoping walls could protect them from whatever stalked the streets. Windows remained shuttered. Conversations were whispered. Meals grew smaller as supplies dwindled. For many, the city that had once felt protective now became a labyrinth of risk, each corner holding the possibility of a silent, unseen threat. Doors were barred not against thieves, but against neighbors. Even the sounds changed. The clatter of carts softened. The chatter of vendors faded. Bells dominated the air, morning bells, warning bells, bells whose tones blended into a single, mournful voice that seemed to call from every direction. It rang through empty courtyards, drifted along rooftops, and settled deep into the minds of those who remained, reminding them with every toll that another strand of the city's rope had frayed. But the collapse did not come all at once. It came slowly, as if the city was exhaling for the last time. Streets emptied, not because everyone had died at once, but because each day fewer people emerged. Each day, a different piece of the urban body stopped moving: a bakery, a workshop, a patrol, a household. The city did not fall dramatically. It unraveled, fibre by fibre, until its great structure sagged into a quiet it had never known before. And as the cities fell inward, suffocating under their own stillness, the countryside, once a refuge from crowded streets, prepared to face an equally devastating transformation. Far from the cities where bells rang endlessly and fear moved in waves, the countryside met the plague in a quieter, more haunting way. Rural Europe did not collapse with the noise of panic. It unraveled in whispers. In countless valleys and hilltop clearings, life simply thinned, then slipped away, leaving behind a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. Here, the sickness moved without spectacle. It drifted along dirt paths, crossed wooden bridges, and found its way into cottages, where doors remained unlatched, because no one expected danger to come from the wind. In these scattered communities, the first signs of change often went unnoticed. A shepherd who failed to return from the fields, a neighbour's chimney that stopped smoking, a miller who didn't arrive to repair a wheel. People assumed someone was delayed, or tending livestock, or visiting distant relatives. The countryside was accustomed to long stretches of solitude, but soon the absences grew too many to explain. The rhythms of rural life, so dependent on regular hands and shared effort, began to stutter. Entire households disappeared within days. Doorsteps remained swept, tools leaned against walls, and meals sat unfinished on wooden tables. Cottages looked as though their occupants had stepped outside for a moment and somehow never returned. Wheat fields ripened untouched, bending under their own weight. Orchards hung heavy with fruit no one came to gather. The land, which for generations had been shaped by human care, seemed suspended in an unfinished season. Travellers occasionally stumbled upon villages where the silence felt almost physical, as if the air itself resisted movement. Wells remained uncovered. Carts stood half-loaded with grain. Laundry fluttered on lines with no one to collect it. Even the animals appeared confused. Cows wandered into gardens. Chickens roosted in abandoned barns. Dogs lingered near doorways, waiting for voices that would never call them inside again. The countryside, once alive with human presence, became a patchwork of empty spaces stitched together by fields that no longer echoed with work. In some regions, shepherds' huts sat deserted on windswept hillsides, their small fires long extinguished. Flocks scattered, leaving wool on thorn bushes as they roamed aimlessly across open meadows. Mills continued to turn in shallow streams, their wooden wheels creaking into the night with no hands left to lift their sacks of grain. The simplest tasks, once so routine they were barely noticed, now seemed monumental in their absence. Without people to guide the motion of daily life, everything moved out of rhythm. The most unsettling part was not the destruction itself, but the quiet that followed. Villages did not burn or fall to siege. They simply stopped. One moment they existed as small, humming centres of family and labour. The next, they were shells of memory. Unlike cities, where fear roared through crowded streets, rural communities vanished with hardly a sound, leaving the impression that entire lifetimes had been erased, rather than ended. Chroniclers wrote less about these empty places because there was no one left to describe them. The countryside became a map of voids, blank spaces, where stories ended abruptly. To those who travelled through these regions, the emptiness felt heavier than any scene of urban panic. It was the silence that lingered, that pressed against the senses, that made even the birds hesitate before landing on abandoned rooftops. And yet, in this stillness, the fragility of medieval living revealed itself with sharp clarity. Rural life had always depended on many hands working together, planting, harvesting, tending, repairing. Remove even a few, and the entire structure trembled. Remove most, and the land itself grieved. The soil lay untouched, the crops unclaimed, the animals uncared for. Nature did not rush to fill the human absence. It merely waited, patient and indifferent. With both city and countryside crumbling, one in noise, the other in silence, Europe faced a terrifying new reality. No one was left to govern. In the earliest days of the plague, people still believed their leaders would step forward and steady the world. Kings had weathered wars, famine, and rebellion. Nobles commanded armies. Priests carried the voice of heaven. There was comfort in imagining that someone, somewhere, understood more than the common citizen ever could. But as the sickness moved deeper into cities and across the countryside, that confidence began to crack. The plague revealed how thin the wall between order and collapse truly was, and how quickly it could crumble when those behind it faltered. Kings withdrew into fortified residences, surrounding themselves with guards, physicians, and whatever luxury they believed might shield them. Royal courts that once bustled with petitions and negotiations fell silent. Edicts were issued from behind closed doors, carried by messengers who feared approaching the sick more than they feared punishment for disobedience. Diplomacy slowed. Councils stopped meeting. Decisions grew rare, delayed, or dismissed entirely. People who had relied on the crown for stability now faced a void where leadership should have stood. Nobles scattered to their estates, each attempting to create a small island of safety. They fortified walls, restricted access, and dismissed servants suspected of illness. Yet these efforts rarely worked. The plague slipped through gatehouses and gardens, carried by a single visitor or a servant returning from a nearby village. Rumours spread of entire noble houses extinguished in a matter of days. Grand stone halls, symbols of permanence, echoed with emptiness as families vanished. Wealth and lineage, once seen as protection, proved powerless against what stalked the land. Priests faced a different fate. Unlike nobles, they could not retreat without abandoning their calling. Many moved among the sick with bravery that bordered on despair. They offered blessings at windows and whispered prayers over bodies that burned with fever. But the cost was devastating. Clergy died in overwhelming numbers, sometimes entire groups within monasteries, leaving sanctuaries deserted. Bells that once marked hours of devotion tolled instead for endless funerals, until even the bell ringers fell ill. In many places, churches stood open but empty, robbed of the very people meant to guide the faithful. As leaders withdrew, fell, or fractured under the weight of crisis, the machinery of governance began to seize. Courts could no longer assemble juries. Judges succumbed to the disease, leaving legal disputes unresolved. Tax collectors vanished, either dead or too afraid to continue their work, causing treasuries to empty. Without revenue, cities could not maintain defences, pay guards, or manage essential operations. The collapse was not sudden. It was a slow, sinking motion, like a ship gradually taking on water until it could no longer stay afloat. Local councils, once responsible for managing markets, trade, and public order, dissolved in many towns. Some members died, others fled. Still, others simply stopped attending meetings, convinced that survival demanded distance rather than duty. Streets that once echoed with debates and announcements became quiet. Notices went unread. Laws were no longer enforced. The idea of civic responsibility eroded as quickly as the population itself. Monasteries, accustomed to discipline and routine, suffered even more dramatically. Their tight living quarters turned them into perfect spaces for the plague's spread. In some regions, entire monastic communities disappeared before news of their decline reached neighbouring towns. Libraries, gardens, and chapels remained, but the hands that once tended them were gone. The silence inside these stone sanctuaries felt heavier than the loudest cries from the cities, for it revealed a loss not just of life, but of continuity. In border regions, where authority had always been thin, chaos spread as lawlessness took hold. With no patrols to keep roads safe, bandits roamed freely. Some attacked travellers, others plundered abandoned farms. Villagers who once trusted local lords now formed small groups to protect themselves, though these efforts offered little comfort. The sense of a shared world began to fade. Loyalty, long anchored in tradition and hierarchy, loosened. People realized that those they had trusted to lead them could no longer explain, contain, or even acknowledge the magnitude of what was happening. Belief in authority evaporated, not through revolution, but through exhaustion, through the slow recognition that no one was steering the collapsing structure. What remained was a continent of individuals surviving by instinct rather than guidance, each household navigating a world with no clear direction. And with the old order broken, Europe entered its darkest chapter. The dead themselves began to reshape the living. In the heart of medieval Europe, the plague altered not only how people lived, but how they died and how the living were forced to face the dead each day. At first, funerals followed familiar patterns, priests reciting prayers, families gathering beside small churchyards, bodies wrapped with care. But as the number of deaths rose with terrifying speed, these rituals collapsed beneath the sheer weight of loss. What had once been solemn became unmanageable. Burial grounds filled, then overflowed. Graves lay half dug, with no one left to finish them. The smooth routines of death, practiced for centuries, fractured. Carts began to roll through the streets at dawn and dusk, their wheels groaning beneath the weight of bodies covered in cloth or hastily sewn shrouds. The men who guided them tried to work quickly, avoiding the sight of faces they might recognize. At times they were forced to collect the dead from doorways, alleys, or abandoned homes where entire families had fallen ill before they could call for help. Some carts were accompanied by a single bell, rung in a slow rhythm meant to warn others to keep their distance. The sound drifted through neighborhoods, echoing off stone walls until it felt less like a warning and more like a heartbeat slowing to a stop. Church bells joined that mournful cadence. They tolled relentlessly, marking not hours but deaths. In some cities, the ringing continued without pause until even the bell ringers collapsed, leaving the towers silent for the first time in memory. That silence felt worse, as though the city itself had given up calling attention to the loss. People walked through streets where the air hung thick with the smell of decay, their steps slower, their eyes lowered. They began to move as if they feared disturbing, something resting just beyond sight. As bodies multiplied, burial practices changed out of necessity. Priests could no longer offer individual rites. Instead, mass pits were dug at the edges of towns and in abandoned fields. Men with shovels worked beside trenches large enough to hold dozens at once. Sometimes the digging went on through the night, torches flickering against the darkness. Witnesses described the pits as vast openings in the earth, silent, waiting, impossibly deep. When the carts arrived, the workers carried out their grim task in near silence. There were no words left to say. Deserted monasteries offered another haunting sight. Many communities of monks and nuns had cared for the sick until they themselves succumbed, leaving behind cloisters filled with stillness. Chapels remained lit by half-burned candles. Prayer books lay open on wooden desks. Gardens went untended. Birds nested in rafters where voices once sang at dawn. Entering these spaces felt like stepping into a world frozen mid-breath, a reminder of how the dead had outnumbered the living so quickly that even places of faith had become hollow shells. The constant presence of death seeped into daily life. People avoided touching anything that might carry the sickness, including the bodies of loved ones. Family members sometimes left the deceased behind closed doors, hoping officials would come quickly with carts. Others dragged bodies to the street, rather than risk letting the illness linger inside. This avoidance carved deep emotional scars. The tender rituals that once surrounded death washing, dressing, blessing, were replaced by urgency and fear. The dead were no longer companions on a spiritual journey. They had become threats. And yet, this proximity to mortality altered more than behavior. It reshaped the way Europeans thought about themselves and the world around them. Seeing bodies on streets, in pits, on carts, made life feel fragile in ways previous generations had never imagined. People felt time differently, faster, sharper, uncertain. They developed a new awareness that life could shift without warning, that existence was not secured by faith, wealth, or community. The weight of bodies was not just physical, it pressed on hearts and minds, forcing a reckoning with questions that had no answers. Children grew up watching death pass by their windows. Adults counted each morning as a quiet victory. Old beliefs about protection and divine order wavered. Some clung more tightly to faith, others loosened their grip entirely. The emotional geography of Europe changed, shaped by an intimacy with mortality that touched every family and every street. And as this emotional burden deepened, another collapse began to unfold. One not of bodies or rituals, but of understanding itself. Knowledge, long trusted to make sense of the world, started to crumble beneath the weight of the unknown. As the plague tightened its grip on Europe, the familiar structures of knowledge began to tremble. People turned first to those who had always explained the world, physicians, priests, and scholars. Yet, each group found its understanding slipping like sand through open fingers. The sickness moved too quickly, killed too unpredictably, and obeyed no pattern that matched the teachings inherited from centuries before. Explanations that once felt sturdy now seemed hollow. Physicians approached the crisis with tools shaped by ancient theories of humours, vapours, and the balance of bodily elements. They believed illness rose from imbalances or corrupted air, drifting through streets like a poisonous mist. They prescribed purges, bleedings, and mixtures of herbs meant to realign the body. Some advised people to avoid sleep, claiming dreams could invite dangerous vapours into the chest. Others urged the burning of incense, insisting the fragrance would cleanse the atmosphere. But the plague ignored every remedy. Doctors who tended the sick often became the next to fall, their presence at bedsides providing no shield against the invisible threat. Their death was its own quiet message. The old knowledge, revered and recited, could not hold back the darkness. Priests faced their own unravelling. They offered prayers for deliverance, organised processions, and urged repentance. In the early days, people gathered in churches seeking comfort and protection. But as clergy died in growing numbers, and as prayers went unanswered, doubt spread through the pews like another kind of fever. Some believers clung more desperately to ritual, convinced that greater devotion might sway divine mercy. Others whispered that heaven had turned away, or that the plague was a test with no clear answer. Faith did not vanish, but its certainty fractured, leaving cracks where fear and confusion settled. Scholars attempted to interpret the crisis through ancient texts and celestial patterns. They studied the movement of planets, searching for alignments that might explain such devastation. Some blamed a conjunction of stars. Others suggested earthquakes had released poisonous fumes from beneath the earth. A few turned to classical authors, hoping forgotten wisdom might illuminate the present. Yet every theory fell short. The plague moved independently of the heavens, ignoring the rhythms scholars had trusted for generations. The intellectual world, built on tradition and manuscript, began to sway. As these pillars weakened, people filled the gaps with imagination, dread, and improvisation. Some turned to superstition, pinning sprigs of herbs to their clothing or hanging charms above their doors. Others sought meaning in omens, a strange light in the sky, a flock of birds flying in an unusual pattern, a dream that lingered upon waking. These interpretations were not foolish. They were attempts to restore a sense of order in a world that no longer felt coherent. When knowledge fails, the mind searches for any thread of certainty to hold. Yet many reacted in the opposite direction, abandoning old explanations entirely. They withdrew from rituals, rejected scholarly authority, and questioned teachings they had once accepted without hesitation. In this unravelling, a new kind of thinking began to flicker. People observed more carefully, noticing where the sickness spread fastest, who survived, and what behaviour seemed to worsen or ease its reach. These observations were not organised or scientific in the modern sense, but they marked a shift, a willingness to look at the world directly rather than through inherited ideas. This quiet shift in thought did not cure the plague, but it opened a crack in the old worldview. Inside that crack lay the early seeds of skepticism and inquiry. In centuries to come, those seeds would bloom into experiments, methods, and discoveries that reshaped human understanding. But in the moment, all Europeans felt was the collapse of the explanations they had trusted. Knowledge had failed them, not through malice, but through limitation. And as understanding faltered, fear searched for targets, shadows to name, people to blame, and stories to shape the unbearable into something tangible. Europe began to look for its scapegoats. As the plague tightened its grip across Europe, fear surged through towns and villages, with a force as destructive as the sickness itself. People sought explanations, desperate for a target they could point to, something tangible they could call the cause of so much loss. When knowledge failed and prayer brought no relief, they turned instead to suspicion. And suspicion, once rooted in a frightened mind, could grow into something far darker. Rumours flowed first in whispers. Someone had poisoned the wells. Someone had summoned curses. Someone had brought the plague intentionally. These whispers settled most heavily on minority communities, especially Jewish neighbourhoods long marginalised by prejudice and isolation. Old suspicions resurfaced with violent clarity. Those already set apart by language, custom, or faith became the easiest to accuse. Fear magnified difference until it became threat. Accusations spread quickly. In some towns, people claimed to have seen strangers loitering near fountains or wells, stirring the water or scattering powders. Others insisted that letters had been intercepted describing plots to wipe out Christian populations. None of these stories rested on evidence. All of them grew from the same soil panic-seeking shape. As the disease continued its relentless advance, people convinced themselves that human hands must have helped guide it. The consequences were immediate and brutal. Pogroms erupted across regions already weakened by grief. Angry crowds stormed homes, dragged innocent people into streets, and set entire communities aflame. Men who had once traded goods with their neighbors now hunted them under the belief that killing the accused would halt the plague. The violence did not stop the sickness. It only deepened the wounds carved into the continent. There were city councils that issued decrees blaming Jews outright, using the chaos of the plague as justification for long-standing prejudices. In some places, leaders forced confessions through torture, shaping narratives that matched the fears of the crowd. Villages emptied not from disease but from persecution, their residents fleeing or perishing at the hands of those who believed violence could restore order. The devastation left behind was immeasurable. Families shattered, cultural memory erased, and trust broken in ways that lasted for centuries. Yet the story of this time is not only one of cruelty, it also contains moments of courage that shone through the darkness. Chronicles speak of individuals, priests, merchants, and ordinary townsfolk who stepped between the mob and their neighbors, insisting that no proof existed, that the plague did not discriminate by faith or heritage. Some hid targeted families in their homes, others escorted them to safety under cover of night. A few spoke publicly against the violence, even knowing the crowd's anger might turn toward them. These quiet acts of defiance remind us that resilience and compassion persisted even as society strained under the weight of fear. Still, such moments were not enough to halt the tide. In many regions, Jewish communities already burdened by generations of marginalization faced annihilation. Their destruction became a second catastrophe, layered atop the first, a tragedy born not of illness but of human desperation. The plague had stripped away familiar structures, government, knowledge, ritual, and with them, the restraint that kept darker impulses in check. The need for blame extended beyond religious minorities. Travelers were harassed, refugees were denied entry, and the poor were accused of spreading disease through filth or laziness. Some claimed beggars carried poison bags, others believed lepers deliberately infected crowds. Everywhere, fear narrowed people's worldviews, reducing strangers to symbols of danger. In this climate, suspicion became defense, and violence a misguided attempt at control. The scars left by this era ran deep. They shaped laws, reinforced divisions, and fueled future persecutions. In many places, surviving Jewish communities were forced into harsher restrictions, their movements and professions constrained by memories of violence. These measures did not prevent future outbreaks. They only reflected the unresolved trauma of a continent that had responded to terror with more terror. And yet, even within this grim landscape, the plague was slowly shifting something fundamental within European consciousness. The violence faded eventually, exhausted rather than resolved. Homes rebuilt, markets reopened, and the survivors attempted to piece together what remained. But the old world, the one that had accepted authority, certainty, and social boundaries without question, was disappearing. What emerged next would not be recovery in the familiar sense, but transformation. The plague had broken more than bodies and beliefs. It had fractured the very idea of stability. And in the space left behind, a new Europe would begin to form, reshaped by everything it had lost. When the worst waves of the plague finally began to fade, Europe did not return to the world it had known. It emerged instead into a silence so wide and unfamiliar that many survivors felt as though they had stepped into a dream. Towns that once hummed with the noise of life now sat half empty. Roads, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps and wagon wheels, echoed with a hollowness no one had ever heard before. It was not the quiet of peace, nor the quiet of rest. It was the quiet left behind when too many voices vanish at once. In some villages, only a handful of people remained to walk streets lined with shuttered homes. They moved slowly, not just from grief, but from disorientation. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt familiar. A baker's shop stood with its door open, but the oven was cold. A market stall leaned at an angle, its goods long spoiled. Wells offered clear water, but no children played near them. Survivors spoke of feeling like guests in their own lives, startled by how easily the world had continued turning without the people who once filled it. Nature, sensing the absence of human hands, began to reclaim what had been shaped by generations. Farmlands lay unploughed, their neat rows dissolving into wild grass. Orchards grew tangled. Vineyards sprawled into thickets. In abandoned fields, young trees took root in soil that had been turned by ploughs every spring for centuries. The outlines of old boundaries blurred as hedges grew thick, and fences leaned and finally collapsed. Forests stretched cautiously toward abandoned hamlets, their branches reaching over crumbling roofs, as though curious about what remained. Animals, too, wandered freely into places once ruled by human presence. Wolves padded through deserted streets, pausing to sniff at doorways before disappearing into the shadows. Deer grazed along roadsides without fear. Birds nested in rafters of churches and barns, filling empty spaces with fluttering wings. For the first time in memory, the continent felt larger than the people left to inhabit it, as though the land had stepped forward to fill the void. This emptiness reshaped not only landscapes but human lives. Work that once required dozens of hands now fell to a few, leaving survivors with burdens too heavy to manage. In some villages, multiple families combined households so they could tend fields together and keep watch during the night. Others abandoned their homes entirely, moving toward towns where at least some semblance of community remained. Travel became strangely free. With fewer guards, fewer tolls, and fewer overseers, people drifted across regions with a sense of possibility that had never existed before. The demographic collapse also marked the beginning of profound economic change. For generations, peasants had lived under the weight of obligation, tied to land, bound to lords, controlled by customs older than memory. But now, the balance had shifted. Labor became rare, and rarity brought unexpected power. Landowners begged for workers, offering wages, freedom of movement, and improved conditions. Peasants, who once toiled without choice, found themselves in demand. They negotiated, refused, or moved on if the terms fell short. A quiet revolution began, not with weapons, but with absence. This shift unsettled the remaining nobility. Their authority had always rested on the certainty that there would be more labourers than land, but now fields lay empty while workers weighed their options. Lords tried to reassert control through decrees and pressure, yet the social fabric had loosened too much to be repaired. When a man realized he could walk 10 miles and find a better offer, old hierarchies cracked. For the first time, the idea of choice entered the lives of those who had long lived without it. Yet the transformation was not purely economic. The emotional landscape of Europe had changed as deeply as the physical one. The emptiness carved into the land was mirrored inside the hearts of its people. Survivors spoke of feeling suspended between two eras, one that had ended abruptly and one that had not yet begun. Their grief was heavy, but beneath it stirred something else, an awareness that the world was no longer fixed. Everything felt open, uncertain, and strangely malleable. And as the shock of loss slowly gave way to this new sense of possibility, the emptiness itself became a kind of canvas. Into that space, opportunity began to seep. The world was broken, but because it was broken, it could be remade. The emptiness slowly transforms into opportunity. In the silent aftermath of the plague, Europe discovered a truth it had never faced before. The lower classes, long dismissed as abundant and replaceable, had suddenly become rare. Entire villages had vanished, and in those that survived, the number of labourers dwindled to a fraction of what once sustained the land. The old hierarchy, lords commanding, peasants obeying, was built on the assumption that workers were plentiful. Now, scarcity changed everything, and with scarcity came leverage. For generations, peasants had lived under rules that bound them to soil they did not own. They owed labour to their lords, paid dues in grain and sweat, and moved only with permission. Choice was a luxury they had never been given. But once the plague emptied the countryside, the surviving workers looked around and realized that the world had tilted. Landowners needed hands far more than hands needed landlords. A quiet shift stirred, subtle at first, like the faint rustle of wind before a storm. Some peasants began to test the boundaries. They left estates without asking, walking away from obligations that had once felt permanent. They travelled to nearby towns seeking better wages, and often found them. Employers, desperate to harvest crops or maintain estates, offered terms that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. Money instead of duties, shorter work periods instead of endless toil, promises of protection in exchange for loyalty. Workers negotiated, and for the first time, negotiation meant power. Others stayed where they were but demanded change. They refused excessive workloads or insisted on payment for tasks once done freely. Some asked for land to cultivate independently. Lords who attempted to enforce old expectations found themselves facing empty fields, overgrown pastures, and barns without staff. Many relented, not out of generosity, but out of necessity. A worker who left might never return, and replacing him was nearly impossible. This shift unfolded not through rebellion in the traditional sense, but through countless small decisions made in kitchens, fields, and village squares. A man choosing to seek a better offer. A woman refusing to work without fair compensation. A group of labourers walking together to a neighbouring estate, knowing the lord there would welcome them. Each act was quiet, almost invisible, but together they formed the first tremors of a social transformation. Some peasants even managed to buy land something once reserved for the wealthy or well-connected. With so many estates abandoned or in debt after the plague, opportunities emerged for those willing to take small risks. A field purchased, a cottage acquired, a contract renegotiated. The very structure of ownership began to loosen, opening cracks through which new futures slipped. These changes unsettled the ruling classes. They had built their authority on stability, on the certainty that peasants had no alternatives. Now, alternatives multiplied. Laws were drafted to freeze wages, restrict movement, and force workers back to their original estates. In some regions, harsh penalties were established for labourers who demanded better treatment. But these measures arrived too late. The psychological shift had already taken place. Once people felt the possibility of freedom, they could no longer pretend it was out of reach. The spread of opportunity did not erase hardship. Work remained difficult, and life remained uncertain. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed in Europe's relationship with labour. The plague, which tore apart families and emptied villages, had also broken an old belief that the lower classes were powerless. In its place grew a new understanding. Labour had value, and those who provided it could shape their own lives. This transformation was neither planned nor celebrated. It emerged from tragedy, from emptiness, from necessity, yet its consequences would echo through centuries. The seeds of modern labour rights choice, mobility, negotiation were planted not in times of prosperity, but in the ruins of loss. But newfound freedom soon met resistance. The old world did not disappear quietly. As Europe struggled to rebuild after the plague, the ruling classes attempted to restore the world that had existed before the devastation. Laws appeared almost overnight, designed to freeze wages, bind workers to their lords, and force life back into familiar patterns. But the plague had done more than empty fields and homes. It had awakened something new in the hearts of ordinary people. Peasants who had tasted negotiation, choice, and movement found it impossible to return to a past defined by obedience. That tension, simmering quietly beneath daily life, eventually burst into revolts that shook kingdoms to their core. These uprisings were not sudden storms of chaos. They grew slowly, like roots pushing through stone. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, attempting to force wages back to pre-plague levels. But workers ignored it. They knew their worth, and they knew the landowners needed them. Frustration grew on both sides. When the burden of taxes increased partly to fund ongoing wars, resentment deepened into something harder, sharper. The peasants' revolt of 1381 did not begin with violence. It began with refusal. Refusal to pay unfair taxes. Refusal to bow to officials who enforced broken systems. Villagers gathered on roadsides and in churchyards, speaking with a quiet clarity that surprised even themselves. They had endured loss, survived emptiness, and rebuilt their lives from the earth up. They no longer accepted a world in which their suffering served the comfort of distant lords. When these refusals met force, crowds grew. Entire villages walked together, carrying tools more suited for fields than battle scythes, axes, staves. Their march to London was not the mindless surge old chronicles sometimes describe, but a deliberate movement driven by collective resolve. Chroniclers note the strange calm that accompanied the crowds, as though grief had forged a new kind of courage. People who had once feared speaking to local officials now demanded audiences with the king himself. The Jacquerie in France bore a similar character. In the years after the plague, the French countryside remained unstable, scarred by both disease and war. Peasants faced crushing demands from nobles seeking to restore their wealth and authority. The people who rose up were not rebels by nature. They were farmers, craftsmen, and labourers who had reached the limits of endurance. Their revolt was born from hunger, exhaustion, and a growing awareness that the feudal order had failed them long before the plague arrived. These revolts were powerful, but short-lived. They lacked leaders with long-term strategies and faced armies trained to suppress any challenge. The crackdowns were swift and brutal. In England, promises made to the rebels were broken almost immediately, followed by executions meant to restore fear. In France, noble forces retaliated with overwhelming violence, determined to erase even the memory of defiance. For a moment, it seemed as if the old order had reasserted itself completely. But beneath the surface, the world had changed too much to return to its former shape. The revolts, though suppressed, revealed something that could not be unlearned: a population aware of its value. Ordinary people had moved collectively, spoken collectively, and challenged centuries of inherited authority. Even in defeat, they carried forward the knowledge that the foundation of feudalism had cracked. Across Europe, lords struggled to enforce old rules. Many found themselves offering concessions simply to keep estates functioning. Wage caps crumbled, restrictions on movement weakened. Fines and obligations were renegotiated. Even when the law claimed to maintain tradition, everyday reality drifted towards something new. The revolts had shown that power did not flow entirely from crowns or castles. It could rise from fields, villages, and the hands of workers who understood their worth. The emotional impact of these rebellions echoed for generations. They were not merely attempts to overturn authority, they were declarations of humanity from people long denied a voice. Chroniclers described them with fear, but within their pages lies another story: the quiet dignity of ordinary individuals demanding fairness after a catastrophe that had touched every life. Their courage planted a seed that would grow slowly, shaping future movements toward rights, representation, and equality. These uprisings, though brief, marked a turning point. The old world was no longer dying, it was already gone. What came next would not be built on obedience or inherited power, but on reinvention. These revolts marked the beginning of the new Europe, one built not from survival, but from transformation and the slow rebuilding of hope. In the years after the plague loosened its grip, Europe found itself surrounded by a strange kind of opportunity, one born not from ambition, but from absence. Across the countryside, vast stretches of farmland lay untended. Once neat fields had grown wild, their boundaries swallowed by weeds. Orchards sagged under fruit that no one harvested. Estates that had stood proudly for generations slumped into disrepair, their roofs caving, their courtyards choked with grass. It was as if the land itself had paused, waiting for someone to choose what it might become next. For centuries, Europe's agricultural world had been tightly bound by feudal obligations. Land could not remain idle, labourers owed service, lords held control over both soil and people. But now, with so many gone, the old system no longer functioned. A field could not be ploughed by laws alone, herds could not be tended through decrees. Lords might command, but without workers, their authority hung in the air like a voice calling into an empty hall. In many regions, surviving landowners tried first to enforce old expectations. They demanded the traditional dues, insisted that peasants return to their former obligations, and threatened fines for disobedience. But reality overruled intention. Workers had become scarce, and scarcity gave them options. Some simply walked away, seeking better terms elsewhere. Others ignored demands entirely, knowing there were not enough officials left to enforce the rules. A quiet shift was underway. The land remained still, patient, and people began to move. Lords soon realized they needed to rethink everything. To keep their estates alive, they had to attract workers, not command them. Incentives replaced orders. Landlords offered wages instead of obligations, freedom instead of bondage, and small plots for personal use instead of mere survival. Some even promised years of reduced rents just to bring families onto vacant fields. The power dynamic between land and labour had reversed. Where workers once competed for access to soil, now the soil competed for workers. This transformation reshaped the countryside slowly, but decisively. Families who had spent generations bound to one estate found themselves courted by several. They weighed offers, considered living conditions, and negotiated improvements. Migration increased as people moved to regions where opportunities seemed brighter. Formerly static communities became fluid, reshaped by movement rather than tradition. As new hands returned to the land, fresh ideas travelled with them. Farming techniques that had been regional began to spread. Some villages adopted three-field crop rotations, others experimented with different grains or new methods of drainage. The shock of the plague created a hunger for efficiency, a need to coax as much as possible from the land with fewer available workers. Tools improved. Methods changed. Slowly, quietly, agricultural innovation took root. The land itself responded. Fields that had been abandoned for years were cleared and replanted. Cottages were rebuilt. Mills restarted. The countryside felt as though it was taking long, cautious breaths after years of suffocating loss. Yet even in renewal, the memory of emptiness lingered. People sensed that every meadow reclaimed, every garden tended, was part of a larger transformation, a shift from a world defined by inherited rights to one shaped by human choice. Some estates, too large to revive, dissolved entirely. Their lands were divided or sold. Fragmentation created opportunities for smallholders to emerge, especially in regions where larger families had survived the plague. Ownership patterns changed. A new kind of rural society began to form not as loud revolution, but as gradual rearrangement. A field newly claimed by a farmer, a pasture taken over by a wandering shepherd, a manor reduced to a cluster of tenant plots, each shift quiet but profound. The change was not evenly spread. In some places, old structures clung tightly to their foundations, but the continent's economic landscape was tilting. The land that once held people in place now beckoned to them, offering possibilities that would have been unimaginable before the plague. A new relationship formed between soil and society, one grounded less in obligation and more in mutual need. Europe's economic map was being redrawn not by battles or decrees, but by vacancy, by fields that waited, by hands that chose, and by a quiet recognition that the old economy could not survive in a world where so many were gone. Economic shifts soon reshaped commerce and trade. When the plague loosened its grip on Europe, it left behind more than empty homes and overgrown fields. It created space vast, unclaimed, and full of possibility. For centuries, power had rested almost entirely in the hands of nobles and landowners. But now their authority flickered. Estates had collapsed, tax systems had faltered, and long stretches of land lay quiet. In that silence, another group began to hear opportunity: the merchants. These were men and women accustomed to movement, negotiation, and risk. Unlike nobles, who relied on inherited privilege, merchants built their fortunes through trade, observation, and timing. And after the plague, timing belonged to them. Roads that had once carried armies now carried caravans. Ships that had waited for royal approval now sailed because a single trader dared to invest. Europe, fractured and shaken, rediscovered motion. Cities like Florence, Venice, Genoa, and Bruges rose with new intensity. Their harbours and market squares hummed long before the rest of the continent regained its voice. Merchants stepped into the vacuum left by weakened aristocracies. They financed expeditions, moved cloth and spices across borders, and reopened trade routes that had gone silent during the worst years. They introduced new methods of keeping accounts, storing wealth, and managing risk, even if they didn't yet use the words that later centuries would give these concepts. In Florence, families of traders began lending money to nobles who had lost revenue when their labourers died. Quietly, almost invisibly, the flow of power shifted. A man with coin could now influence decisions once made only by birthright. In Venice, merchant fleets expanded, carrying glass, silk, and precious metals across seas once feared for sickness and piracy. Every ship that returned safely confirmed a growing truth. Movement was wealth, and those who controlled movement shaped the future. Bruges, with its northern winds and busy canals, became a crossroads where English wool met Flemish weavers, where German metals found southern markets, and where merchants from distant kingdoms gathered in counting houses lit by small oil lamps. In these meetings over ledgers, maps, and murmured deals, Europe's new economy took form. No royal decree could match the influence of these quiet transactions between determined traders. The plague had broken old monopolies, guilds weakened, noble privileges sputtered, long-standing barriers between regions loosened. Ambitious individuals saw openings everywhere. A man who once sold grain in a village market could now travel to a nearby city and find buyers eager for anything that could be shipped reliably. A young woman with a skill for keeping numbers might be hired to manage a merchant's accounts, earning wages that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier. The map of opportunity widened in every direction. These shifts reshaped the rhythms of daily life. Inns and warehouses multiplied along trade routes. Moneylenders appeared in towns that had never seen formal credit. Traders began insuring cargo against storms or theft, sharing risk in ways that made distant ventures possible. None of this felt like a revolution at the time. It felt like survival, a way to rebuild the world with the tools that still worked. But beneath the practical needs and hurried exchanges, a deeper transformation was unfolding. Europe was learning to trust movement more than inheritance, calculation more than tradition. People began to measure wealth, not in acres of land, but in the ability to turn goods into profit, to send ships across seas, to expand networks beyond borders. The foundations of a new era, one driven by trade rather than lineage, settled into place with remarkable quietness. The merchants themselves were not visionaries of a distant future. They were individuals stepping into gaps left by catastrophe. Yet their actions rewrote the balance of power. As ships left, the docks and caravans set out across reawakened roads. Europe's pulse changed. The continent had entered a new phase one, where markets replaced courts, where ambition rivaled birthright, and where money flowed through channels no king could fully control. And as coin moved, culture followed. From this rising web of trade, a forgotten light began to return. When the plague finally loosened its grip on Europe, it left behind a continent deeply shaken, not just in its economy and population, but in its understanding of existence itself. Survivors carried more than memories of loss. They carried a sense that the world was far more fragile and far more mysterious than past teachings had allowed. The old explanations had failed. The old systems had crumbled. And in that vast emptiness of certainty, new ways of seeing quietly began to bloom. People who had spent months surrounded by death developed a sharper hunger for life. This longing did not announce itself with fanfare. It appeared in subtle ways: curiosity, experimentation, a desire to observe the world directly rather than inherit it through doctrine. In workshops, universities, and monasteries that had survived the devastation, minds began to drift toward questions that once would have seemed unnecessary or even dangerous. What was the human body? How did the heavens move? What defined beauty? What was the purpose of existence? These questions were not new, but the urgency behind them had changed. Old beliefs, shaken by crisis, became more pliable. The authority of tradition no longer felt absolute. With priests unable to stop the plague, and scholars unable to explain it, people began to trust their own senses a little more. They watched the world closely: shadows on walls, the shape of leaves, the angle of bones beneath skin. Observation became a quiet rebellion against the uncertainty that had swallowed so much. In art, this shift appeared first as a return to realism. Painters in cities like Florence, Siena, and Padua began to study the human figure with unprecedented devotion. They sketched from life, capturing muscles, wrinkles, and expressions that older medieval styles had avoided. Some scholars believe this fascination with the body grew, in part, from living so close to its vulnerability. When death touched every household, the human form became both fragile and extraordinary. Artists sought to honor it, to understand it, to restore dignity to a world that had seen so much decay. Color deepened, light sharpened, faces gained individuality. Instead of depicting humanity as symbolic, artists revealed it as deeply personal. Frescoes and altarpieces filled with life painters capturing not divine perfection, but human emotion. Even religious art changed, reflecting grief, tenderness, and longing in ways that resonated with a population still recovering from trauma. Science, too, shifted subtly but decisively. Instead of relying solely on ancient texts, thinkers began to observe nature itself. They watched stars, tracked the phases of the moon, studied plants, and experimented with simple mechanical devices. The plague had exposed the limits of inherited knowledge, and so people sought answers not in repetition, but in discovery. This was the beginning of a slow but profound transformation, a move toward the observational mindset that would eventually shape the scientific revolution. Literature reflected the new emotional landscape. Writers explored themes of love, mortality, and the human condition with a depth shaped by personal loss. Petrarch wrote of longing and memory. Boccaccio captured both horror and humor in stories of plague-stricken Florence. Their works did not simply record events. They examined what it meant to be alive in a world where death had shown its teeth. In their pages, readers found both comfort and reflection, a way to make sense of an experience too vast to hold privately. Across Europe, the Renaissance did not begin with a single spark, nor did it emerge solely because of the plague. Its roots already existed in trade, in education, in the growing wealth of cities. But the plague accelerated these changes by stripping away illusions that had shielded the old order from scrutiny. In the aftermath, people were ready to rebuild themselves intellectually, spiritually, and creatively. They looked backward to ancient Rome and Greece, seeking wisdom in forgotten texts. They looked inward, exploring the depths of the human mind. And they looked outward, imagining a world governed not simply by divine will or feudal law, but by reason, beauty, and human potential. The most striking part of this transformation was its emotional core. People who had lived beside so much death became obsessed with capturing life, honoring it, understanding it, celebrating it. Art flourished not in spite of the catastrophe, but in the shadow it cast. Creativity became a response to mortality, a way to reclaim meaning from the ruins. And as Europe's mind transformed, its politics shifted with it, carried forward by individuals and cities reshaped by everything they had endured. In the generations after the plague, Europe's monarchs faced a landscape that no ruler before them had ever encountered. The feudal world they inherited had been hollowed out. Nobles had lost wealth, manpower, and prestige. Local authorities had crumbled. Whole territories were scattered with abandoned estates and fragmented towns. At first, this emptiness seemed like a threat to royal power. But for kings who understood the moment, it became something else entirely, a rare opportunity to rebuild authority from the ground up. For centuries, monarchs had ruled through a delicate balance of negotiation, tradition, and noble cooperation. Feudal lords commanded armies, collected taxes, and enforced local law. The crown depended on their loyalty, and in return, nobles received wide autonomy. But after the plague, this arrangement no longer functioned. Many noble families had vanished entirely. Others lacked the labor to farm their lands or muster meaningful military support. Their influence dissolved like mist in sunlight, leaving gaps in the political order that demanded filling. Kings stepped into these gaps with a quiet determination. Instead of relying on fractured feudal bonds, they turned towards something more stable: centralized administration. Royal councils expanded. Clerks, scribes, and accountants multiplied in number, forming the early skeleton of modern bureaucracy. Records were kept more carefully than before. Censuses were attempted. Laws were written with new precision. This shift did not happen overnight. It unfolded through countless small adjustments, as monarchs realized they could govern directly, rather than through intermediaries. Taxation, long dependent on noble collection, began to change as well. With local authorities weakened, kings experimented with new methods. Some imposed direct taxes on households or trade. Others standardized coinage, stabilizing royal revenue. These innovations were not always welcomed, but they worked. The crown gained resources at a time when nobles could barely maintain their own estates. Money, once filtered through layers of aristocratic control, flowed increasingly toward the center. Authority followed. Armies transformed even more dramatically. The plague had shattered the traditional feudal levy, the expectation that nobles would provide soldiers in times of war. Many could no longer fulfill those obligations. In response, monarchs turned to professional troops. Mercenaries were hired, trained, and armed by the crown. Over time, this evolved into standing armies, bound not to noble houses but to the monarch himself. A king with a reliable army no longer needed to fear noble rebellion in the way his predecessors had. Military power, perhaps more than anything, cemented the shift towards centralized rule. As administrative networks expanded, kings developed a new vision of governance. They no longer saw themselves merely as supreme lords within a web of feudal relationships, but as rulers of entire, unified territories. Borders became clearer. Responsibilities became defined. Laws applied more evenly, reaching regions that had once been dominated by local custom. What emerged, slowly and quietly, were the foundations of modern nation-states: centralized authority, standardized law, reliable taxation, and professional military force. The most striking part of this transformation was its subtlety. It did not resemble conquest or revolution. Instead, it unfolded through paperwork, coinage, and administration tools far quieter than swords. Demographic collapse had shifted the balance of power without a single decisive battle. Monarchs simply adapted more effectively than nobles. With fewer powerful rivals to counter them, kings shaped political destiny in ways earlier generations could never have imagined. The emotional landscape of governance changed as well. Subjects who once saw kings as distant symbolic figures now encountered their power more directly through royal officials, tax collectors, legal courts, and soldiers. This did not always inspire loyalty, but it created structure, and structure brought stability. After decades of chaos, many accepted this new order as a necessary anchor in a world still haunted by memories of loss. Yet monarchs were not blind to the fragility of their new power. They understood that authority built on shifting demographics required constant reinforcement, so they invested in roads, fortifications, and administrative buildings. They cultivated alliances with merchants, clergy, and emerging urban elites. Their states became more intricate, more interconnected, and more dependent on the machinery of bureaucracy than on inherited loyalty. By the close of the 14th and 15th centuries, Europe had begun to tilt toward a new political age. The plague had not created strong monarchies on its own, but it had hollowed out the structures that once limited them. The kings who rose in its wake became architects of modern governance, not through force of arms, but through the quiet power of administration. But kings were not the only winners. New powers were rising from the ashes. In the decades after the plague, a surprising kind of resilience began to emerge, not in the countryside, where labour remained scarce and estates crumbled, but in the cities that managed to survive. Though many of them had lost half their population or more, the shock of depopulation did not break them. Instead, it reshaped them. With rural nobility weakened and traditional power structures fractured, cities stepped forward to claim a larger role in the shaping of Europe. Urban centres had always been different from the countryside. They relied not on harvests, but on trade, craft, and cooperation. And while the plague devastated their crowded streets, it could not dissolve the organizational habits that had held these communities together for centuries. In places like Florence, Venice, Milan, Lubeck, and Bruges, the survivors returned to their squares and workshops with a determination to rebuild not only their livelihoods, but their systems of rule. Guilds rose first. These associations of craftsmen, merchants, and artisans had always held economic influence, but now they claimed political ground as well. With noble oversight diminished, guild leaders filled the vacuum. They organized labor, regulated markets, and maintained order within city walls. Their councils, not distant lords, decided wages, storage rules, production standards, and even military responsibilities. Under their guidance, cities became engines of organization, capable of responding to crisis through collective decision rather than inherited hierarchy. City councils expanded alongside the guilds, turning urban governments into structured bodies that resembled early republics more than medieval enclaves. In Florence, the signoria took on new authority, shaping policy with a mixture of commercial pragmatism and political ambition. In Venice, the Great Council refined its complex system of elections, building a government that combined aristocratic tradition with mercantile logic. These were not democracies in the modern sense, but they were built on participation, on the idea that governance required active involvement from those who lived and worked within the city's walls. Urban planning evolved as well. With populations reduced, cities reimagined their spaces. Streets were widened, buildings rebuilt, market squares reorganized. Some neighborhoods were consolidated, others were expanded to prepare for future growth. The plague had forced Europeans to confront how cities functioned, and in its wake, many sought to improve circulation, sanitation, and access. Though true modern hygiene was still far away, the seeds of urban planning were planted in these reflections. Geography, too, was reshaped by catastrophe. Cities that had managed to maintain trade routes during the plague, especially port cities and river hubs, became centers of wealth. They recovered faster because they had infrastructure that encouraged movement. Cloth from Flanders, spices from the east, glass from Venice, wool from England, all flowed again through a network that grew more intricate and more economically decisive. As rural estates weakened, these urban nodes tightened their hold on regional power. Some cities even became states unto themselves. Venice, protected by water and disciplined by commerce, wielded influence stretching from the Adriatic to the eastern Mediterranean. Florence, fueled by banking and industry, shaped the political and cultural heart of Italy. Lubeck led the Hanseatic League, turning northern Europe's trade into a coordinated system of towns bound by mutual interest. These city-states were not merely survivors of the plague, they were beneficiaries of a world where organization mattered more than lineage. The emotional tone of this transformation was subtle but profound. For many urban dwellers, survival brought not just grief, but purpose. They had seen chaos firsthand and understood the need for structure. Their cities became shared experiments in governance, resilience, and reinvention. People discovered that strength could come from cooperation, and that political power could grow from market stalls, workshops, and counting houses just as easily as from castles. As cities asserted more control, Europe's political landscape shifted again. Urban governments began negotiating with kings, shaping laws, and funding armies. The balance of power tilted toward places where people gathered, traded, and organized toward hubs where wealth accumulated and decisions could be made quickly. The new political order created new conflicts and new ambitions. When the plague swept through Europe, it struck not only families and fields, but the very institution that had shaped medieval life, the church. Priests died in enormous numbers, often at higher rates than the general population, because they stayed beside the sick long after others fled. Monasteries lost entire generations. Parishes went empty. Across the continent, bells rang with mourning until there was no one left to ring them. For the first time in centuries, the church seemed vulnerable, its spiritual authority dimmed by its inability to halt the catastrophe or explain it. But institutions, like people, can transform under pressure. In the years that followed, the church began a slow, deliberate rebuilding. This was not a triumphant revival. It was a quiet struggle, shaped by necessity, humility, and a recognition that the old ways could not continue unchanged. The first challenge was simply replacing the clergy. With so many priests gone, Europe faced an acute spiritual vacuum. Villages had no one to offer sacraments, hear confessions, or provide final rites. To fill this void, the church accelerated training programs and accepted new candidates from broader backgrounds. Young men who once would not have been considered because of class, education, or lineage now entered the clergy. This shift diversified the priesthood and subtly lowered the social barriers that had once separated clergy from ordinary people. Monastic life also transformed. Some orders had been nearly wiped out, their libraries abandoned, and their routines broken. But in the rebuilding process, new emphasis was placed on discipline, education, and spiritual rigor. Monasteries became centers of study again, preserving texts and teaching literacy to novices. The trauma of the plague forced these communities to reconsider their purpose. They emerged more structured, more organized, and more introspective than before. The church also strengthened its administrative systems. Those who survived understood that spiritual authority required clearer governance. Bishops kept more thorough records. Parish boundaries were reassessed. Training requirements became stricter. The papacy, already drifting towards centralized authority in the centuries before the plague, used the moment to tighten its administrative grip. Rome became the anchor for a church determined to restore coherence across a fractured landscape. Corruption, long a quiet companion to power, became harder to hide in this new environment. The plague's devastation had stripped away much of the institutional excess that had accumulated over generations. People who had experienced profound loss demanded sincerity from their clergy. Priests who exploited their positions faced harsher scrutiny, not because reform had fully arrived, but because Europe had changed. A world that had walked so close to death no longer tolerated hollow rituals or arrogance with the same patience as before. education rose in importance as well. Universities, some of which had nearly collapsed during the crisis, became vital in training priests and theologians. Scholars examined not only scripture, but philosophy, medicine, and law. The desire to understand the world, to make sense of suffering, pushed the church to engage with new ideas. Though the institution remained rooted in tradition, it became more intellectually active, subtly planting seeds that would later grow into theological debate and reform. The church's renewed structure also brought new orders into prominence. Groups focused on charity, education, and public service expanded their reach. They cared for orphans, tended to the poor, and rebuilt communities. These acts of service helped restore trust in an institution that had faltered during the worst years of the plague. Gradually, people came to see the church not just as a shaken authority, but as a stabilizing force in a world forever changed. Yet beneath this restoration lay a paradox. In rebuilding itself, the church also created the conditions for future upheaval. The centralization of authority, the emphasis on education, and the growing involvement of scholars in theological matters all contributed to tensions that would eventually erupt in the Reformation. The very efforts that strengthened the church's structure also made its flaws more visible. Reformers of the next century would draw from the intellectual and spiritual groundwork laid during this rebuilding. Still, in the decades after the plague, the church's recovery played a crucial role in Europe's stabilization. Its renewed hierarchy, broader social reach, and heightened discipline provided guidance to communities still haunted by memories of loss. The institution did not reclaim its former unquestioned power, but it adapted, survived, and prepared, unknowingly, for the greatest transformation it would ever face. Europe's political rebirth now began reshaping its relationship with the wider world. In the first generations after the plague, Europe carried a strange duality within its spirit. The weight of a trauma that lingered in every memory, and a growing desire to step out from under that shadow. People had lived for so long with fear of breath, of touch, of strangers, of the unseen. When the worst had finally passed, that fear did not simply vanish. It softened, it loosened its grip. And in the quiet space it left behind, something unexpected began to grow: curiosity. It began at the level of emotion, not ambition. Survivors found themselves looking outward more often toward the horizon, toward distant regions they had only heard about, toward seas that had once represented danger. For so long, the instinct had been to retreat, to close doors, to hide from the invisible threat. Now, people felt the opposite pull. The world had already shown its darkest depths. What remained was the desire to understand it, to move within it, to discover what else it held. Merchants, sailors, and scholars were among the first to feel this shift. Their work had always involved observation and travel, but after the plague, their motivations changed. It was no longer enough to maintain old routes. New ones had to be sought. Maps that had once been crude sketches gained detail and accuracy. Travelers recorded roads, coastlines, and mountain passes with renewed attention, as if charting the world were a way of reclaiming control over life itself. Every new detail, an inlet, a village, a river bend, felt like a step away from helplessness. Trade expanded with surprising speed. European markets, disrupted by the plague's devastation, embraced goods from distant lands. Spices, silks, dyes, metals, and books traveled across borders with increasing regularity. Each exchange carried not just material wealth, but whispers of other cultures, other possibilities. The movement of goods became the movement of ideas. A merchant returning from Constantinople or Alexandria did more than sell cargo. He carried stories that made distant worlds feel closer. Intellectually, Europe was awakening. Scholars, who had watched traditional knowledge fail during the plague, grew more willing to question, to compare, to explore new disciplines. They read texts from the Islamic world, studied ancient Greek manuscripts newly recovered, and began considering ideas that had drifted outside the boundaries of medieval thought. Curiosity transformed monasteries, universities, and private libraries into places where the world was examined rather than merely accepted. Spiritual curiosity blossomed as well. The plague had shaken religious certainty, but it had not destroyed faith. Instead, it prompted people to search more deeply. Pilgrimages increased. Mystical movements flourished. Individuals sought meaning not just in doctrine, but in nature, art, and personal reflection. The desire for understanding spread across classes, across regions, across generations. Even the land itself encouraged exploration. Depopulation had opened vast stretches of unclaimed or poorly managed territory. Forests encroached on abandoned fields. Paths that had once served specific estates now wound through empty terrain. Young people walked these roads, sometimes simply because they could, because the world felt larger, freer, more open than it had in living memory. Movement became a kind of healing. Curiosity also revealed itself in quieter forms. Artworks portrayed landscapes with greater detail. Writers described foreign customs with fascination rather than suspicion. Builders experimented with perspective, light, and proportion. Everywhere, the impulse was the same: to understand, to observe, to reach outward. Europe had learned, painfully, how fragile life was. Now, it wanted to experience it fully. This curiosity was not purely philosophical. It carried practical consequences. Improved maps supported navigation, expanded trade networks increased wealth. New knowledge strengthened states. Curiosity turned into connection between cities, between regions, between continents. The transformation was subtle but profound. A continent that had once feared the outside world now leaned toward it. Emotionally, this shift marked a quiet turning point. Generations who had lived under the shadow of death now raised children who saw life with different eyes. They encouraged them to learn, to travel, to ask questions. The world had shown its capacity for devastation. Now people wanted to know what else it could reveal. Curiosity became a form of resilience, a way of stepping into uncertainty without being ruled by it. And as curiosity spread, it began to transform into something stronger, more determined, and far-reaching. Europe no longer wished merely to understand what lay beyond its borders. Curiosity soon becomes ambition, and ambition drives expansion. In the generations after the plague, Europe entered a strange and unexpected moment of possibility. So many had been lost that the survivors inherited a world with more land, more resources, and slowly more wealth per person. Fields once divided among many families now belonged to a few. Cities that had faced ruin rebuilt themselves with new industries. Trade grew, knowledge moved, and curiosity stretched outward like a tide returning after years of retreat. Without realizing it, Europe was preparing itself for a century that would redraw the world. Exploration did not begin with a single decision or a bold announcement. It grew from countless quiet shifts in daily life. Shipbuilders, seeking to make vessels more efficient for growing trade, experimented with new designs. Hulls were strengthened, rigs improved. Navigators, inspired by the expanding availability of maps and astronomical learning, refined charts and instruments. The compass, once a novelty, became a trusted guide. These innovations were not created for conquest but for commerce, for the simple desire to move more safely across water. Economic changes nudged exploration forward as well. With populations smaller and wealth more concentrated, investors sought new opportunities. Merchants dreamed of reaching markets beyond the familiar Mediterranean routes. Kings and princes, watching their treasuries expand through revived taxation, funded ventures that promised profit and prestige. The competition among European states, soft at first, then sharper, created an environment in which distant voyages felt increasingly reasonable. Intellectual shifts added fuel to this slow-burning transformation. Scholars read ancient Greek and Roman accounts of the wider world. Travelers returning from the East brought stories of distant kingdoms, rare goods, and unfamiliar stars. The borders of knowledge seemed wider than the borders of any one nation. A new confidence formed a sense that with enough skill, enough patience, and enough courage, the world could be understood through experience rather than rumor. The emotional landscape of Europe also played a role. After surviving a catastrophe that had erased entire communities, many no longer saw the world as a place to be feared. They viewed it as a place to be explored, tested, and mapped. The plague had shattered old certainties, but it had also weakened old limitations. When people have already witnessed the fragility of life, the unknown becomes less terrifying and more inviting. Voyages that once would have seemed reckless now felt like opportunities. As these forces converged, European ships began to travel farther. Portuguese sailors hugged the coast of Africa. inching southward with each expedition. Italian navigators, employed by various courts, dreamed of reaching the east by sailing west. Northern merchants ventured deeper into the Atlantic, searching for fisheries and new passages. These early voyages were cautious, small in scale, and often unsuccessful, but each one pushed the horizon a little farther. What makes this period remarkable is how natural the transition appears when viewed in hindsight. Europe did not set out to conquer the world, it set out to understand it. Exploration was an extension of trade, curiosity, and improved technology. It grew from a continent learning to rebuild itself, one that sought new routes, not for glory, but for possibility. Yet the consequences would reach far beyond anything the early explorers imagined. Their movements would connect continents, disrupt civilizations, and spark exchanges that reshaped economies, cultures, and environments across the globe. But in this early stage, before the dramatic encounters and tragic collisions, exploration still felt like a tentative step into a larger world, a quiet suspicion that the Earth was bigger than maps suggested. Europe expanded not through a roar, but through a murmur. A ship leaving harbour at dawn, a navigator testing a new instrument, a merchant funding a voyage with cautious hope. These were the small beginnings of a global transformation. Europe expands, but expansion brings consequences. When Europe began to look outward in the century after the plague, it did so with no understanding of how far its influence would reach. The earliest voyages were modest, the first expanded trade routes fragile, and the new diplomatic ties tentative. Yet beneath these cautious beginnings lay the foundation of something enormous, a global shift born not from deliberate ambition, but from slow demographic changes that had started with sickness. The Black Death had thinned populations, weakened old hierarchies, and unbalanced economies. That imbalance created movement, and that movement created contact. Step by step, the world's distant regions began to brush against one another. Those first encounters were uneven, unpredictable, and often accidental. A Portuguese ship reaching a West African port brought European metal goods and returned with ivory and pepper. A Venetian trader bartered in the Levant, carrying not only fabrics and spices home, but also stories of new routes and unfamiliar kingdoms. Northern sailors pushed into the Atlantic, discovering islands that had never appeared on earlier maps. These moments were small in themselves, but each one nudged Europe farther from its old insularity. Trade networks shifted in response. Goods that once flowed only through the Silk Road or Mediterranean intermediaries began to move along emerging sea routes. Silver, copper, textiles, and fish travelled farther and faster than before. More importantly, ideas travelled with them. Ideas about geography, navigation, religion, and governance. People learned of lands where customs differed, where rulers followed unfamiliar laws, where nature looked strange. Every interaction widened Europe's sense of what the world was and what it could become. And these connections did not flow in only one direction. As Europe reached outward, other cultures felt the impact. African kingdoms expanded their trading networks to adapt to new markets. Cities in the Middle East and Central Asia recalibrated their economic influence as European merchants sought alternate pathways to the east. In Asia, new political and commercial pressures emerged as foreign ships began appearing at once quiet ports. Though the scale was small at first, the pattern was unmistakable. Contact created change. The consequences unfolded with a slow, tidal rhythm. Sometimes they brought mutual benefit, shared knowledge, exchanged goods, technological diffusion. Compass improvements, ship designs, and agricultural techniques crossed cultural borders. Artistic motifs travelled across continents. Mathematical ideas moved between languages. Even religious thought began weaving itself through new channels. None of these early exchanges were fully peaceful or equal, but they formed the first threads of a world gradually knitting itself together. Other consequences, however, were sharpened by conflict. Competition between European states intensified as each sought access to valuable routes and coastal footholds. Rivalries grew between merchants, kingdoms, and emerging empires. Treaties were drafted, alliances formed. Each decision carried implications that would echo across oceans. And though Europeans of this era did not yet imagine the scale of future colonization, the early outlines of global competition were already visible, traced in the lines of maps, the ambitions of court advisors, and the restless movements of fleets. From a distance, these developments might seem inevitable. but their roots were tangled in the aftermath of the plague. The demographic collapse had redistributed wealth, encouraged mobility, weakened traditional elites, and expanded the influence of merchants. It had shifted Europe's energy from internal stability to external opportunity. In a sense, the world was being drawn together not by intention, but by the long shadow of a medieval catastrophe. The emotional tone of this transformation was layered. To some, the widening world offered hope, fresh markets, new knowledge, and the promise of distant horizons. To others, it created uncertainty, raising questions about identity, sovereignty, and belief. Everyday people heard rumors of strange lands and unfamiliar peoples carried back by sailors, traders, or traveling scholars. These stories stirred fascination and unease in equal measure. What makes this period remarkable is how subtle it felt at the time. No one living through it could grasp the full chain reaction unfolding around them. A change in labor structure here, a new trade route there, a slightly improved ship, a new navigational insight, a shift in royal policy, each seemed small, isolated. But together, they formed the first ripples of global connectivity, setting into motion patterns that would eventually reshape continents. By the end of the 15th century, Europe stood at the edge of a world it hardly understood. The consequences of reaching outward would be profound, transforming economies, societies, and ecosystems far from European shores. But in these early moments, the movement was quiet, exploratory, and filled with possibility. A continent that had nearly died was now touching distant worlds, and those worlds were beginning to touch back. As Europe reshaped the world, it also reshaped its own understanding of humanity. In the decades after the plague loosened its hold on Europe, people found themselves carrying more than the memories of lost families and empty streets. They carried a new way of thinking, one shaped not by books or leaders, but by the simple fact of having lived through the worst disaster imaginable. The Black Death had reached into every home, rattled every belief, and touched nearly every mind. Surviving it did not bring clarity. It brought questions that lingered like smoke over the continent. At first, these questions appeared quietly, woven into daily life. People walked through rebuilt markets and newly planted fields with a heightened awareness of how quickly everything could vanish. The fragility of the world, once an abstract notion discussed in sermons, had become intimate. Bread tasted different when one had seen hunger. Songs sounded deeper when one had heard months of funeral bells. To live after the plague was to feel life with sharper edges. Fear did not disappear, it transformed. During the plague's height, fear had been immediate, overwhelming, and consuming. It pushed people inward. But once the danger receded, the fear settled into something quieter. Reflection. Europeans began contemplating the nature of existence, the unpredictability of time, and the meaning of suffering. Many felt compelled to make sense of what had happened, not through doctrine alone, but through personal thought and shared experience. This was the beginning of a subtle philosophical shift, one that encouraged individuals to observe themselves with new honesty. Art captured this transformation first. Painters and sculptors found themselves drawn to the human form with unprecedented intensity. Faces showed emotion instead of symbolic perfection. Scenes depicted not just saints and heroes, but ordinary people caught between fear and hope. The beauty of life felt inseparable from the memory of death, and artists sought to express that duality. Their work reflected a psychological landscape in which vulnerability and strength coexisted, where every moment could be both fleeting and meaningful. Literature responded similarly. Writers explored themes of memory, longing, and the passage of time. They grappled with questions of fate and choice. The plague had revealed how quickly the world could shift, and this awareness seeped into stories, poems, and chronicles. Even when authors wrote about love or humor, an undercurrent of fragility remained. Books became mirrors, helping people understand their own emotions as they navigated life after trauma. Daily behavior changed as well. People valued community in new ways, perhaps because they had seen how isolation deepened suffering. Festivals regained importance. Communal meals became acts of reaffirmation, not just habit. At the same time, some individuals turned inward, seeking personal meaning through solitude, prayer, or quiet contemplation. Europe became a continent of mixed impulses. Celebration mingled with introspection, laughter shadowed by memory. The experience of survival also altered how people understood time. Before the plague, Life had been anchored by tradition, steady routines, and predictable seasons. Afterward, time felt less stable. People married earlier, saved less cautiously, traveled more willingly, and took risks that previous generations might have avoided. There was a growing sense that the future was not guaranteed, and therefore it was to be used, not merely awaited. This shift in attitude created a subtle but lasting cultural momentum, encouraging experimentation in both daily life and intellectual pursuits. Community bonds strengthened in some places and fractured in others. Where priests, healers, or neighbors had shown compassion during the plague, deep trust grew. In regions where fear had turned to suspicion or violence, wounds lingered. But everywhere, people carried a shared understanding that survival created obligations to rebuild, to care for one another, and to search for meaning in a world that had revealed its unpredictability. This psychological evolution did not happen uniformly. Some individuals clung tightly to old beliefs, hoping stability could be rebuilt through tradition alone. Others embraced uncertainty, seeking new interpretations of faith, nature, and the human mind. Yet across the continent, the general direction of thought drifted toward introspection, toward an awareness that life was both delicate and extraordinary. Surviving the plague did not make Europeans fearless. Instead, it made them more thoughtful. They questioned long-accepted truths, looked inward for understanding, and began exploring the world around them with new sensitivity. What had once been fear became curiosity. What had once been despair became resilience. This shift in thinking, born from trauma, shaped by memory, laid the groundwork for the next great transformation. This shift in thinking lays the groundwork for the next transformation: scientific curiosity. In the centuries before the plague, Europe had relied heavily on inherited wisdom. Medical knowledge came from ancient texts, philosophical truths from long-established authorities, and explanations of the natural world from tradition rather than observation. When the Black Death swept across the continent, these foundations cracked. Physicians who followed classical teachings could not stop the disease. Scholars who trusted ancient theories found their explanations failing as quickly as their patients. Religious leaders offered comfort, but their prayers did not halt the devastation. When the plague finally passed, it left behind a population that still believed, but believed differently. This was not a sudden rejection of the past. It was a quiet, almost reluctant shift, born from the realization that established knowledge had fallen short. Survivors did not abandon tradition outright. Instead, they approached it with a more questioning mind. A habit of doubt took root. People asked more, observed more, and trusted experience slightly more than they had before. The trauma of uncertainty made curiosity not a luxury, but a necessity. Medicine was the first field to feel this transformation. During the plague years, physicians had relied on humoral theory, astrological charts, and ancient commentaries. When these failed, some began to look more closely at symptoms, patterns, and environmental conditions. Early experiments in quarantine at Italian ports were imperfect, but effective enough to encourage more practical approaches. Over time, curiosity about the human body expanded. Anatomical studies increased, initially in secret, and later with cautious approval. Scholars sketched bones, muscles, and organs with growing accuracy. The body, once interpreted through symbolism, slowly became an object of study. Natural philosophy shifted as well. Instead of accepting inherited explanations about the stars, seasons, or weather, thinkers began recording their own observations. They tracked celestial movements, measured shadows, and compared their results against ancient texts. When discrepancies appeared, they did not always dismiss them. The idea that nature could be understood through direct study, rather than solely through doctrine, gained quiet momentum. Libraries and universities reflected this change in tone. Scholars debated more boldly. They compared manuscripts, questioned translations, and sought missing texts from the Islamic world and ancient Greece. Ideas flowed more freely as trade routes expanded, and travelers brought back unfamiliar knowledge. Europe was no longer isolated within its own traditions. It was absorbing insights from distant cultures that had developed their own sciences, mathematics, and philosophies. This growing exchange of information fed a new intellectual atmosphere, one in which questioning was not rebellion, but exploration. The plague had taught people that survival depended on understanding the world, not simply accepting it. Each unanswered question, each failed theory, became fuel for deeper inquiry. Even monks and theologians, once the strict guardians of tradition, engaged more seriously with natural philosophy. They wanted explanations they could trust, grounded in the world they observed. The shift was subtle but irreversible. Doubt became a tool, not a threat. Curiosity became a habit, not an exception. Experiments, measurements, and first-hand knowledge gradually gained prestige. This mindset did not yet resemble the scientific revolution that would arise centuries later, but it pointed unmistakably toward it. Europe's thinkers had learned, through tragedy, that truth could not rely solely on authority. It needed evidence, comparison, and repeated observation. Emotionally, this transformation reflected a deeper psychological change. People who had lived through the unpredictability of the plague understood that the world could not be controlled by belief alone. This understanding fostered humility, but also determination. If danger could strike without warning, then knowledge became a shield and a way to reclaim agency. The desire to understand nature, to predict its rhythms and uncover its laws, grew from the same impulse that pushed earlier generations to rebuild their homes and societies. Curiosity was survival in another form. By the end of the 15th century, Europe had not yet become the scientific powerhouse it would later be. But the seeds were planted. A mindset shaped by trauma had blossomed into a culture that valued observation, inquiry, and the courage to question. As Europe's mind changed, its culture did too. In the years after the plague receded, Europe discovered that its collective grief had settled not only into memory, but into imagination. Artists, writers, and musicians found themselves standing before a world forever altered, compelled to express what words alone could not contain. The Black Death had shown the continent the thinness of the line between life and loss, and from that awareness emerged a new artistic language, one shaped by mortality, yet filled with an even deeper longing for life. Painters were among the first to respond. Before the plague, medieval art had focused on symbolic representation. Flat figures, heavenly gold backgrounds, and idealized expressions. But after so much death, symbolism felt insufficient. People wanted to see the human face, its sorrow, its hope, its wrinkles, its muscles, its fragile beauty. Artists began studying real bodies, sketching from life rather than copying old models. They painted shadows as they fell, not as tradition dictated. Hands, eyes, and gestures became expressive tools rather than decorative forms. Perspective, once a distant curiosity, became a way to make scenes feel grounded in the physical world. This shift was not merely technical, it was emotional. Artists who had seen death everywhere sought to capture the value of the living moment with greater honesty. In their frescoes, saints grieved, mothers worried, workers strained. Light and shadow became metaphors for the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. Even scenes of religious devotion carried traces of human vulnerability, as though artists understood that faith itself had been reshaped by the trauma people carried inside them. Writers felt the same pull toward authenticity. Chroniclers described the plague years with stark detail, often struggling to articulate what they had witnessed. Later authors explored questions of fate, chance, and the unfairness of suffering. Why did some live while others died? What determined the span of a human life? Could meaning be found in randomness? Their stories wove together humor, sorrow, and moral reflection. Even when the plague was not mentioned directly, its shadow lingered behind every theme. Some writers turned inward, examining memory and longing. Others turned outward, imagining journeys, encounters, and new worlds. The desire to understand humanity expanded the boundaries of literature. Characters became more complex. Emotions deepened. Narratives embraced ambiguity. The old certainty, where every event served a divine purpose, gave way to a recognition that life was unpredictable and that meaning had to be sought, not assumed. Music, too, transformed. Composers experimented with harmonies that evoked longing, tension, and release. New forms of polyphony emerged, capturing the layered emotions of a society living between grief and renewal. Voices intertwined like memories, sometimes clashing, sometimes resolving with surprising tenderness. In churches, chants evolved to reflect both reverence and sorrow. In courts, secular music developed richer textures, echoing the emotional range the plague had opened within the human psyche. These shifts across the arts were not coordinated. They arose from individuals trying to make sense of their experiences. But together, they created a cultural landscape unlike anything Europe had known. The trauma of the plague had stripped away illusions of permanence. Artists no longer depicted the world as a stable, divinely ordered stage. They showed it as fragile, temporary, and profoundly human. And yet, rather than collapsing into despair, their work blossomed with vitality. Death had sharpened their appreciation for life, pushing them to capture every flicker of emotion, every fleeting moment of beauty, before it slipped away. This artistic awakening did more than reflect grief. It became a form of healing. People saw their own fears and hopes mirrored in paintings, poems, and melodies. Art gave shape to emotions that were too heavy or too subtle to speak aloud. It allowed communities to remember together, mourn together, and eventually move forward together. Even centuries later, the art of the post-plague era carries that emotional resonance, the sense of a world rediscovering itself after staring into the abyss. The connection between death and creativity created a cultural momentum that would fuel the Renaissance and shape European expression for generations. Artists became philosophers. Writers became explorers of the human heart. Musicians became interpreters of emotional truth. A continent traumatized by loss became one of the most vibrant centers of artistic innovation the world had ever seen. Europe's mind had changed. But what of its future? When we think of the Black Death, we tend to imagine it sealed inside the distant past, an event trapped in old manuscripts, illuminated margins, and fading chronicles. Yet its fingerprints rest quietly across the world we inhabit today. The plague reshaped economies, rebalanced societies, and altered the course of thought in ways so subtle and so enduring that they now feel natural, almost inevitable. But none of it was inevitable. Much of what we call modern life exists because a medieval tragedy forced Europe to reinvent itself. Consider the rights and freedoms many people take for granted. The ability to choose where to work, to negotiate wages, to move from place to place without the permission of a landowner. These freedoms emerged not through smooth political evolution, but through the chaos that followed the plague. With labour scarce, workers gained bargaining power, and the centuries-long shift toward recognition of individual rights began almost imperceptibly. Every modern contract, every workplace negotiation, carries the faint echo of fields once left empty. Urban life, too, bears the imprint of the plague. Cities that survived the devastation rebuilt themselves with stronger institutions, more stable governance, and more flexible political structures. Many of the laws, councils, and administrative systems that shape modern urban government grew from the need to organize, coordinate, and protect communities after the plague's collapse of rural authority. When we walk through city streets lit by infrastructure, guided by zoning, protected by civic administration, we are living in the aftermath of decisions first taken in a world struggling to recover. Scientific thinking owes an even deeper debt to the plague. The failure of medieval explanations, humoral theory, astrological prediction, and religious certainty created a habit of questioning that never fully faded. Step by step, skepticism became inquiry, inquiry became observation, observation became experiment, and experiment became the foundation of modern science. The trust we place in evidence, research, medicine, and technology has its roots in a trauma that forced Europe to look at the world with clearer eyes. Every hospital, laboratory, and scientific instrument is connected to that moment of rupture when old knowledge faltered and new thinking quietly began. Global trade and cultural exchange also flowered in the shadow of loss. With populations reduced and wealth concentrated, Europe's appetite for trade expanded. Merchants traveled further. Routes widened. Curiosity spread. These early expansions set the stage for a world knitted together by movement goods crossing oceans, ideas moving across continents, cultures influencing cultures in a vast, ongoing exchange. Today's globalized economies, with all their complexity and interdependence, you can trace their lineage back to ports that reopened after years of silence, and to sailors who set out in search of new horizons. Even our cultural diversity reflects this legacy. The Renaissance, enriched by observation and emotion, carried forward a renewed appreciation for the human experience, its complexity, beauty, and fragility. That shift encouraged openness to new ideas, foreign philosophies, and artistic influences. Our modern belief that cultures can coexist, influence one another, and grow through contact is part of the long ripple created by a continent searching for meaning after immense loss. Yet the inheritance is not only structural or intellectual. It lives in our expectations, our sense that life can change suddenly, that societies can rebuild, that meaning can be shaped rather than inherited. It lives in our awareness of time, a subtle understanding that life is fragile and precious, that moments matter because they cannot be guaranteed. These echoes are quiet, but they guide the way we build families, communities, cities, and nations. History does not sit behind us like a closed door. It moves beside us, shaping choices so familiar we rarely question their origins. The plague forced Europe to rethink everything: work, governance, faith, knowledge, and identity. Those shifts did not remain confined to the Middle Ages. They radiated outward across centuries, carried by generations who never knew the source of the changes shaping their world. To live in the modern age is to inhabit a tapestry woven partly from medieval catastrophe and medieval resilience. The freedoms we enjoy, the cities we inhabit, the sciences we trust, and the global networks we rely on all emerged from a world forced to rebuild from ashes. The beauty of that inheritance lies in its complexity. It is both gift and scar, progress and reminder. We now move from inheritance to meaning, what the plague truly taught humanity. When we look back at the Black Death, the scale of suffering can feel overwhelming. Millions lost, cities emptied, families erased. Yet beneath the statistics lies something deeper, a portrait of what people become when the world around them falls apart. The plague was not only a biological disaster, it was a mirror, and what it reflected was the full spectrum of human nature: our fragility, our resilience, our fear, and our capacity for compassion. The first lesson the plague offered was how delicate life truly is. In medieval Europe, people believed the world followed a clear, stable order: God above, kings below, nature in its place, and humanity protected by tradition. The Black Death shattered that illusion in months. It revealed that everything people trusted, health, hierarchy, certainty, could dissolve in silence. That revelation changed how individuals saw their own lives. Even today, when crises strike, we feel the same shock. The sudden awareness that the structures we depend on are far more breakable than they seem. But fragility was only part of the story. The plague also exposed resilience. Survivors rebuilt their homes, retilled abandoned fields, restored cities, and reimagined their institutions. They mourned, but they did not stop living. They adapted in ways they could never have predicted, changing economies, reshaping knowledge, and nurturing new forms of creativity. Human beings, confronted with devastation, discovered they could bend without breaking. This resilience still defines us. When modern disasters strike, people respond with the same mixture of grief and determination. Fear was another powerful force revealed by the plague. It drove some to hide, flee, or lash out. It fueled rumors and violence. It made communities turn against outsiders, looking for someone to blame. These reactions were not medieval flaws, they were human instincts under pressure. Even now, in moments of uncertainty, we see how quickly fear can distort judgment. The plague reminds us that fear is part of us, but also that we must learn to recognize and temper it before it shapes our actions. Yet, alongside fear came compassion. Chronicles tell of priests who stayed with the dying, neighbors who shared food with orphaned children, and families who chose to care for one another despite the risks. Compassion did not erase the darkness of the time, but it illuminated it. The plague revealed that even when the world narrows to survival, people reach for connection. This instinct to comfort, protect, and stand beside one another continues to surface in every modern crisis, a quiet testament to the humanity we carry forward. Creativity, too, emerged from the trauma. Artists, writers, and thinkers transformed their grief into expression. They turned sorrow into frescoes, fear into poetry, uncertainty into questioning. It is one of the strangest truths of human nature. Suffering can spark imagination, and devastation can open paths to renewal. The plague taught Europe that meaning can be rebuilt, not inherited, that beauty can grow from the places where life has cracked. These lessons, fragility, resilience, fear, compassion, creativity are not medieval lessons. They are human ones. Technology, politics, and culture change. But emotional instincts remain steady across centuries. When everything collapses, what remains of us is not our systems or our achievements. What remains is our nature, our need to understand, to create, to connect, and to endure. The story of the plague is not just a historical narrative. It is a reminder that crises do not simply destroy, they reveal. They show who we are, what we value, and how we choose to rebuild after the worst has passed. And in that revelation lies the quiet wisdom that binds past and present. This reflection leads into the final contemplation. Not what changed, but how we choose to remember. As the documentary draws to its end, the story returns to the quiet tone from which it began. A Europe unaware of what approached, walking through markets, tending fields, ringing church bells with no sense of what shadows waited beyond the horizon. But now, after travelling through centuries of consequence, we can see clearly what those people could not, that history does not vanish once an event ends. It lingers, it reshapes. It echoes in ways subtle enough to go unnoticed, yet powerful enough to define entire eras. When the plague first swept across the continent, it seemed to many that the world itself was dying. Houses stood silent, villages emptied, cities trembled under the weight of loss. It felt like the end of something ancient and irreplaceable. But endings in history are rarely final. They are thresholds. Through them, people carry what they have endured, what they have learned, and what they hope to rebuild. The Black Death did not extinguish European civilization. It forced it into transformation. Imagine the fields after the plague's retreat, overgrown, quiet, waiting. Those empty meadows were more than symbols of death. They were invitations. They offered space to rethink labor, ownership, and community. Every abandoned plot was a possibility. Every collapsed estate, a blank page. Out of these absences, a new social order emerged, one shaped by workers who discovered their value, by cities that learned to govern themselves, and by monarchs who built new forms of authority. The silence of the land was not the end of an era, but the breath before the next one began. The same was true of Europe's mind. Medieval certainty had cracked under the weight of catastrophe, revealing a need to question, to observe, to understand. In monasteries, universities, and workshops, thinkers began exploring nature with fresh eyes. Artists studied the human body with reverence. Scientists tested ideas experimentally. Writers grappled with meaning. These shifts did not arise in spite of the plague, but through the wounds it left behind. From trauma grew curiosity. From sorrow grew creativity. From uncertainty grew reason. And as Europe rediscovered itself intellectually, it also reached outward physically. The rebuilt ports, the improved ships, the new maps, none of these were coincidences. They were part of a broader awakening, a sense that the world held more than familiar borders could contain. The age of exploration, with all its complexities and consequences, grew from a continent seeking breath after suffocation. The world map expanded because Europe had been forced to rethink its place within it. History continued its arc through these transformations, carrying forward ideas that would shape the modern age: labor rights, scientific inquiry, global trade, artistic realism, centralized governance, and cultural exchange. Every one of these developments contains within it the faint trace of a disaster no one alive today witnessed, yet everyone alive today lives inside. And now, in our era, so far removed from medieval Europe, yet so deeply connected, we still feel that echo. We see it in how we respond to crises, how we rebuild after loss, how we seek meaning in uncertainty. We see it in the way societies value health, knowledge, and human connection. We see it in our cities, shaped by centuries of adaptation. We see it in the very idea of progress, the belief that the future can be different from the past. The Black Death remains one of the clearest reminders that catastrophe is not only destruction, it is revelation. It exposes the fragile scaffolding of daily life, revealing hidden strengths and hidden weaknesses. It forces change where stability once held firm. And it shows, again and again, that civilizations endure not because they avoid disaster, but because they reshape themselves after it. As the narrator steps back from the story, the final image is not a plague cart or an empty street. It is a quiet horizon dawn, spreading across fields that once lay silent. A reminder that even the darkest chapters give way to light, and that human beings, generation after generation, continue to rebuild the world they inherit. What if the Black Death didn't end an era, but began the one we live in now? That is the mystery history leaves us with, that the past is never truly gone. Its echo never ends. It moves beneath our choices, our systems, our beliefs, guiding us silently toward futures shaped by memories we do not consciously carry. This is the end of the documentary, but the beginning of the story the audience must now carry forward.